Dust swirled around Michael and Jake as they pushed open the heavy attic door. The hinges creaked in protest, as if the door itself was reluctant to reveal the secrets hidden within. The air was thick with dust, particles dancing in the dim light that filtered through the small, grimy window. A musty smell, like old books and forgotten dreams, filled the air. The scent was almost tangible, wrapping around them like a shroud. It was a smell that spoke of years of neglect, of memories long since abandoned. "You sure about this, Jake?" Michael whispered, his voice shaky. The question hung in the air, heavy with doubt and fear. Michael's eyes darted around the attic, taking in the shadows that seemed to move on their own. Jake, trying to appear brave, shrugged. "What's there to be scared of?" he said, but his voice betrayed his bravado. He forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. The truth was, he was just as scared as Michael, if not more. A sudden gust of wind slammed the attic door shut, plunging them into darkness. The sound echoed through the attic, a loud bang that made them both jump. The darkness was complete, swallowing them whole. "See, even the house doesn't want us here," Michael said, his voice barely a whisper. His words were meant to be a joke, but there was no humor in them. The fear was real, and it was growing with each passing second. Jake fumbled for his flashlight, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The light revealed more of the attic, but it also seemed to make the shadows deeper, more menacing. Every corner held a potential threat, every shadow a hidden danger. They were surrounded by towering stacks of boxes, old furniture draped in dusty sheets, and forgotten toys scattered across the floor. Each item seemed to have a story, a history that was just out of reach. The attic was a graveyard of memories, each one more haunting than the last. A sudden creak echoed through the attic, followed by a faint whisper that sent chills down their spines. The sound was barely audible, but it was enough to make their hearts race. It was as if the attic itself was alive, watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. They froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. The fear was palpable, a living thing that wrapped around them, squeezing the breath from their lungs. They stood there, paralyzed, waiting for something to happen. "Did you hear that?" Michael whispered, his eyes wide with fear. His voice was barely audible, a mere breath of sound. The question was rhetorical, they both knew the answer. "Probably just the wind," Jake said, but his voice lacked conviction. He wanted to believe it, needed to believe it, but deep down he knew better. The attic was more than just a room, it was a presence, a malevolent force that watched their every move. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. The sensation was overwhelming, a constant pressure at the back of his mind. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to get out while he still could. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. It was a primal reaction, a warning from his body that danger was near. He could feel the eyes on him, watching, waiting. The attic held a strange energy, a palpable tension that seemed to crackle in the air. It was like static electricity, a constant hum that set their nerves on edge. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, as if something was about to happen. They cautiously moved deeper into the attic, each creak and groan of the floorboards making them jump. Every step was a challenge, a test of their courage. The further they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became until it felt like they were wading through molasses. A cobweb brushed against Michael's face and he swatted it away, his skin crawling. The air was thick with dust and every breath felt like inhaling the past. The old house had been abandoned for years, and it showed in every creak of the floorboards and every whisper of the wind through broken windows. He shone his flashlight around, the beam revealing more and more dusty relics of a forgotten past. Old portraits with eyes that seemed to follow him, furniture draped in white sheets like ghosts, and shelves filled with trinkets that once held meaning to someone long gone. Then he saw it, a shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, moving near the far wall. It was not just a trick of the light, it had a presence, a weight that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He felt a chill run down his spine, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. "Jake, look," he hissed, pointing the flashlight towards the moving shadow. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it echoed in the stillness of the room. Jake whipped his head around, his flashlight beam joining Michael's. The two beams converged on the shadow, which seemed to writhe and twist as if trying to escape the light. The shadow flickered, seeming to shrink back from the light. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, like smoke caught in a breeze. but there was something almost sentient about it, something that made it feel alive. They cautiously approached it, their hearts pounding a frantic rhythm against their ribs. Each step felt like a journey, the distance between them and the shadow stretching out impossibly long. The air grew colder, and the sense of dread deepened with every inch they closed. As they got closer, the shadow seemed to dissipate, melting into the darkness like it was never there. It was as if the very fabric of the room had swallowed it whole, leaving no trace behind. "What was that?" Michael whispered, his voice tight with fear. He could still feel the presence of the shadow lingering in the corners of his mind. Jake shook his head, his face pale in the flashlight beam. "I don't know, but I don't like it." His voice was shaky, betraying the fear he was trying to hide. He ran his hand over his face, trying to regain his composure. The encounter had rattled him more than he cared to admit, and he could see the same fear reflected in Michael's eyes. "Come on, let's keep looking," he said, his voice firmer now, trying to mask his growing unease. They had come here for answers, and they couldn't leave without finding something, anything, that could explain what they had just witnessed. The sudden silence after the shadow disappeared was more unnerving than any noise. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. They were being watched, they could feel it in their bones. The sensation was palpable, a prickling at the back of their necks that made them want to turn around and run, but they stood their ground, determined to uncover the secrets of the moving shadow. They continued their exploration, the silence broken only by their hushed whispers and the sound of their own breathing. The air grew heavy, almost suffocating, as if an unseen presence was pressing down on them. Michael wiped his brow, his hand coming away damp. "It's freezing in here," he muttered, his breath misting in the cold air. "It's July, Michael," Jake said, his voice tight. He, too, could feel the sudden drop in temperature. The air grew thick with a strange energy, sending shivers down their spines. They both felt it, a presence, unseen but felt, watching their every move. An unseen entity moved among the shadows, its presence palpable but its form invisible. A sudden gust of wind blew through the attic, though the windows were tightly boarded shut. The wind seemed to swirl around them, whispering unintelligible words that sent chills down their spines. Michael and Jake huddled closer, their fear a tangible thing between them. They had stumbled upon something sinister, something that sent a primal fear echoing through their bones. "We should go," Michael whispered, his voice trembling. The fear in his eyes was unmistakable, a reflection of the terror that gripped his heart. He had never felt such an overwhelming sense of dread before, and it was as if the very air around him was thick with malevolence. He felt a growing sense of dread, a certainty that something was terribly wrong. The walls seemed to close in on him, and every creak and groan of the old house sent shivers down his spine. It was as if the house itself was alive, watching their every move. Jake hesitated, torn between his curiosity and his growing unease. He had always been the braver of the two, the one who sought out adventure and the unknown, but this place was different. It was as if the house was warning them, urging them to leave before it was too late. The house seemed to pulsate around them, a living, breathing entity. The walls appeared to move, almost as if they were alive, and the air was thick with an oppressive energy that made it hard to breathe. It was as if the house was trying to communicate with them, to tell them something important. Then, they heard it again. A whisper, faint but undeniable, coming from the walls themselves. It was a sound that sent chills down their spines, a voice that seemed to come from another world. The whispers were soft, almost gentle, but there was an underlying menace to them that made their blood run cold. The whispers seemed to slither around them, pronouncements in an unknown language. What did it say? The words were unintelligible, but the tone was clear. It was a warning, a plea, or perhaps a curse. The symbols on the walls seemed to glow faintly, adding to the eerie atmosphere. Michael asked, his eyes darting around the room. He was trying to find the source of the whispers, but it was as if they were coming from everywhere at once. The room seemed to close in on him, and he felt a growing sense of panic. He couldn't pinpoint the source of the whispers, but they seemed to be coming from every direction at once. It was as if the house itself was speaking to them, trying to convey a message that they couldn't understand. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Michael felt a sense of urgency. Jake shook his head, his face pale. He had never been so scared in his life, and he could see the fear reflected in Michael's eyes. They were in over their heads, and they both knew it. The house was not just a building, it was a living, breathing entity, and it was not happy with their presence. "I don't know, I couldn't understand it," he whispered back, his voice barely audible above the murmuring of the walls. The whispers seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if trying to convey a message that was just out of reach. The air was thick with tension, and they both felt a growing sense of dread. He whispered back, his voice barely audible above the murmuring of the walls. The whispers seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if trying to convey a message that was just out of reach. The air was thick with tension, and they both felt a growing sense of dread. The air crackled with an unnatural energy, and the shadows seemed to dance and writhe in response to the whispers. It was as if the house was alive, reacting to their presence, and the energy in the room was almost palpable. The shadows seemed to take on a life of their own, moving and shifting in ways that defied explanation. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if trying to convey a message. It was as if the house was trying to tell them something, to warn them of a danger that they couldn't see. The air was thick with tension, and they both felt a growing sense of dread. Michael and Jake exchanged a terrified look. They both knew that they were in over their heads, and that they needed to get out of the house as quickly as possible. But the whispers seemed to hold them in place, as if the house itself was trying to keep them there. Something was trying to communicate with them, something trapped within the walls of the old house. It was as if the house was alive, and it was trying to tell them something important. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and they both felt a growing sense of dread. The house held secrets, dark and ancient, and they had unwittingly stumbled upon something they weren't meant to find. The whispers seemed to grow louder, more insistent, and they both felt a growing sense of dread. They needed to get out of the house, but the whispers seemed to hold them in place, as if the house itself was trying to keep them there. A battered trunk, tucked beneath a dusty old easel, caught Jake's eye. He brushed away the cobwebs, revealing a tarnished brass lock. "Think there's a key for this somewhere?" he asked, his voice echoing in the silence that had settled over the attic. Michael scanned the cluttered surfaces. Maybe on that shelf, he pointed towards a rickety shelf overflowing with odds and ends. It took them several minutes of careful searching, but they finally found a tarnished, ornate key that looked like it might fit. With trembling hands, Jake inserted the key and turned. The lock clicked open with a heavy thud. Inside the trunk, nestled amongst yellowed lace and faded photographs, lay a leather-bound diary, its pages filled with spidery handwriting. "What do you think it says?" Michael asked, leaning closer as Jake gently lifted the diary from the trunk. The leather was cold and slightly damp beneath his fingers, sending a shiver down his spine. As Jake flipped open the diary, a gust of wind slammed the attic door shut again, plunging them into darkness. A cold dread filled the air, heavier than before, as if the diary's opening had awakened something sinister within the house.